Working for you all? Yeah, thumbs up.
Certainly
Thank you very
working
much
for
indeed,
me.
Tim.
Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, I think we're good to go. That's fantastic. Thank you, thank you. Yes, so I do write about outdoor nature spirituality, and in a way, this talk it talks about the role of outdoor worship in primitive Methodism, but I'm going to set that in the wider context of Christianity in general and Christian tradition and spirituality in general. Partly because I'm really passionate about it, and I think I'm not going to talk about something that's just historical, but something that is life-giving and is ongoing now, that we can continue, and that has a very, very long role in the kind of healthy development of all communities and all faith traditions. So I will be setting it in a wider context, which means you'll be getting to see some nice, pretty pictures. So that, I mean, if I simplify it down like that, because one thing is, we're talking about outdoor worship and that kind of you know, the fresh air and the wider horizons and so on, but here we are all sitting in front of our computer screens on Zoom, and I thought that's slightly those two cut against each other slightly. So as a kindness to you and to myself, we're going to have some photos of outdoor places. Outdoor spirituality has taken place, and afterwards I will run outside and do my morning prayer, which I haven't done yet, out in my back garden. So I'm going to be getting my pixel-free time today as well. But thank you all for coming along today and plugging in. Just for, we're going to have I think an hour. I believe that's right with Ruth. Yeah. So there'll be time to chat as well when I've gone through things. And talking about outdoor worship and that kind of very long tradition of people going out of the city, of the town, of the buildings in order to practice their devotions, to meet, to talk, to pray, and to engage in ritual. It's definitely true that the Methodist movement and the primitive Methodists in particular have a real affinity with that. They have a real witness in that area and going outdoors. And the primitive Methodists actually picked up that outdoor preaching and meeting kind of culture of the Methodists and pushed it up a gear, I would say. They really did take it further along. And we're going to talk today, obviously, it is the 250th year of Hugh Bourne, of his birth. And there's a picture here. This is from, here we go, here's a little plug for you, Ruth. This is from the Englesea Brook Chapel and Museum. If you haven't been, you need to go. There is Hugh Bourne, along with William Clowes, who helped set up the primitive Methodists. And there they are. So I'll be talking about Hugh Bourne down there on the left, and also that outdoor worship. And it's no coincidence that the very top of this commemorative plate is one of the outdoor sites where almost the primitive Methodists are said to have begun. That was their first kind of big event. So that really places it in that context almost immediately. And so I'll be talking about, as I say, Methodism and primitive Methodism, but also the wider kind of panorama, the wider sort of perspective that this can kind of teach us now. So the Methodists did begin with a really big focus on outdoor preaching, and I imagine most of us here know about primitive Methodism, but I think it's worth very briefly recapping exactly who the primitive Methodists were. And the primitive Methodists, it just refers to the fact they were a revival movement, and they wanted to recapture the culture and the energy of the primal, the early Methodists. So they call themselves the primitive Methodists. I wish they'd given themselves a slightly better name, because whenever it kind of sounds like they were kind of anti, I don't know, they were some Luddites or something, but they weren't. They were just trying to go back to the original kind of ethos, the primal ethos of what drove John and Charles Wesley out there into the outdoors. But anyway, it was a revival of the early energy of the Methodists, which they kind of were trying to inspire. It's a bit like how every single Christian church initiative that you ever read about, they say, oh yes, we're inspired by the early church. So anything, fresh expressions, you name it, anything at all, every Christian will try and say, oh no, we're basing ourselves on the early church. And it's a bit like that in Methodism too. They want to say we're inspired by the early iteration of Methodism, which is a kind of interesting instinct. I mean, religion needs to base itself on tradition, so you see where it comes from. But anyway, they were very keen to recapture the early spirit. They saw themselves as authentic, authentically Methodist. Which brings us to the gentleman in question, Hugh Bourne, who, as I say, set up the primitive Methodist. He more than anyone. There were others as well, of course, but it was his big kind of drive, his energy that pushed it forwards. And it emerged as a separate strand, if you like, a kind of separate identifiable form of Methodism in about 1807, 1808. And we are celebrating him today. It's Hugh Bourne's 250. He was born in Stoke-on-Trent in 1772. So you can do your maths just to confirm that that is indeed 250 years ago. His life does slightly overlap with the Wesley brothers, but he never met either of them. John Wesley died in 1791. So Hugh Bourne would have been 19 years old when that happened, but they never met. Hugh Bourne wasn't actually a Methodist at that point. So as far as I'm aware, I've looked, and he didn't seem to have any connection to Methodism while those two founders were still alive. And he converted later on in life, partly inspired by his mother in 1799. And he then became quite active in the Methodist Church, and he preached his first sermon. No surprises, it was outdoors. In 1801. Maybe we should reintroduce that, and everyone should preach outdoors as their first sermon. But he was a keen and energetic member of the mainstream Methodist movement, and he picked up on that kind of pedigree for outdoor worship. As we know, John Wesley was really driven to preach outdoors, and it was a major part of the kind of the DNA of early Methodism, was the fact that they would just get up and go out and preach wherever they could. Here you see him in quite a rural setting. He'd also preach in parks and streets and so on. It featured very highly in one book on early Methodist architecture. It kind of paints a very bucolic picture of this kind of move to the outdoors that John and Charles Wesley, John Wesley in particular, showed. As he says here, the architectural setting for most early Methodist worship was that of nature itself. I love this: the grass for its floor, the trees for its columns, the sky its roof, and a rock or a hillock its pulpit. So you can; those are very redolent. Those words would certainly work for Hugh Bourne as well, primitive Methodists. And also note that thing: trees as columns, rock as pulpit. That's where we're at with this talk today. And I have, as Tim kindly said, I've travelled the length and breadth of Britain doing research on holy places. And I can't help but read that little phrase there by this historian, and just think of so many iterations of Christianity interacting with the landscape. I've written about Celtic spirituality a lot. And that's kind of the spirit of the early Celtic Christians as well, moving outdoors, preaching where people, particularly pagan people, had real connections to the land, to the landscape, picking landmarks and so on as places to punctuate what they were saying, to pin it down into the real world. And John Wesley really did take this to kind of a long way. In 1739, John Wesley apparently preached 500 sermons, but only 8 of those were indoors were in a church building, according to this book I quoted. So only 8 out of 500 were actually in a conventional church. Huge numbers of them, very much an outdoor church. And this point struck me when I visited a really lovely place down in Winchelsea in East Sussex. This is called the Wesley Tree. It's I was talking there about that quote there: trees its columns. There, John Wesley preached his last open air sermon in 1790, 1 year before he died. And it's there just beyond the bounds of the churchyard wall. You can see the wall in the background. That's Winchelsea Church. So he's not the first great leader to have a tree attached to his name. There's lots of them, lots of Celtic trees, which were linked to early saints and missionaries. But I think John Wesley is probably the first Christian leader for 1,000 years to have a tree in his name. That isn't the actual tree he preached under. It's a descendant, because the ash trees don't live that long. But I think it's quite rare to have that kind of really strong connection, to have a Wesley tree. I think that's really great. So I enjoyed going along to that. You probably heard the phrase, the Gospel Oak. There's a railway station called Gospel Oak in London, so you will have heard of it. And that was part of outdoor worship certainly in medieval times in particular. And it would be a place where people would gather, probably during a rogation walk, when they walk the bounds of the parish or whatever. And they would stop there and they'd hear a reading from the Bible. And I checked to see if the Gospel Oak railway station is named after an actual tree, and there was a tree there, an oak tree, obviously, just near the station. And I was very amused to see that actually John Wesley had gone to that very tree and also preached a sermon at Gospel Oak as well. So he did like his landmark trees. The actual oak itself is long gone. It died around 1800. And there is, round the corner, there's a from that Gospel Oak, and indeed from this place here, if you go round the corner, just a few meters away, a few steps away, there's also a chapel. So there's a very early chapel near Gospel Oak in London, and round the corner from this fine tree, there we go, is the early chapel, Wesleyan chapel in Winchelsea as well. And I just want to use those two juxtapositions of those kind of, the tree named after them, you know, the preaching place, and then these chapels which were then set up, because that for me represents that really kind of important shift, that move away from outdoor preaching, that the established church, once it got going and it became a kind of community, they would move indoors. These chapels were built during the life of Wesley quite often. There was a steady move away from outdoor preaching. That early embrace of the wind and the rain did subside and move kind of to indoors, to a more kind of sedate form of worship. So by the turn of the 19th century, by around 1800, when Hugh Bourne became Methodist himself, the Methodists had a really big network of chapels up and down the land. Less than a generation, a decade or so after the Wesley brothers had died, some people in the Methodist Church were getting a bit restless at the settled nature of this kind of new, this kind of just going back to sitting in a building once a week kind of worship thing. And they were sort of thinking, well, hang on, this is, you know, we're just recreating the Church of England, but in a kind of more domesticated way. So they had a real, there was a desire to recapture that early spirit that drove people to preach and meet outdoors. And at this point, enter Hugh Bourne. And looking at his life and so on, he did have a real kind of draw to the almost slightly mystical side of nature worship. The first kind of inklings, or one of his first kind of forays, if you like, into really pushing into outdoor worship, was with a wonderful group of people who I didn't know about before I started researching my talk, but they were called the Magic Methodists. Why don't we use that name again? I love it. They were just a slightly crazy bunch of people who they also called themselves the Forest Methodists as well, and that name definitely is one that would be less contested to, or it is being revived now. We have Forest Church we're just talking about. And the Magic Methodists were a small group who were there around this time, who were going out and worshipping, as you can see in this picture, in nature. It's not the most flattering of pictures, but that was how they were seen, as this slightly wild group. They were a small community, as I say, based 13 miles from Chester, near a village called Cuddington. And they were inspired again by the early energy of the Wesley brothers. And they built a remote chapel, and they called it the Forest Chapel in the Woods. As far as I'm aware, the location of that early chapel of the Magic Methodists is not known, although there is somebody logged in here who knows the Chester area well. So in the chat afterwards, I may be interrogating to see if anybody has any more knowledge, because I like founding sites of spirituality and so on. But the Magic Methodists were this group who would kind of meet outdoors, and the members would have trances and visions. You can see in the pictures there, everyone's carried away. That never happens when I preach, that's for sure. But maybe some of you have got that kind of early energy of Methodism which is kind of they're revived. They certainly had a kind of real name for it, and they were viewed with quite a lot of suspicion. Hugh Bourne himself went along intending to denounce such carrying-ons, but he actually found himself impressed with their zeal and became friends with their leader. I won't go on too much more about the Magic Methodists. That's somebody else's task to look into them, I'm sure. But there's plenty of online material if you want to look at what they were up to. So Hugh Bourne was interested in worship and worship communities on the margins. And he was obviously quite unjudgmental if he went along expected to frown in this kind of early 19th century way, and didn't. He kind of listened and looked and took it on board. He was quite broad-minded. He had a rather bigger vision in mind, and his big vision took us to this place here, which is where he began the Primitive Methodists in May, end of May 1807. And it's this place. It's a village. It's actually pronounced Mau-Cop, Mau like how, not Mo-Cop. I'm going to get that wrong during this talk, I know. But anyway, Mau-Cop in Staffordshire, 6 miles north of Stoke-on-Trent, and it's a natural hillock, a natural hill at the back of a village called Mau-Cop. And on top of it is this fake ruin, a folly. It's not a real castle, it's a fake castle that had been built 60 years previously, perched on this kind of craggy outcrop of rock. And it was here, this very place here, 1807, when Hugh Bourne gathered his first great crowd of followers, and they had a 14-hour meeting at this site. It was a mammoth exercise and a mammoth event. There were 4 different preaching stations dotted around this hillside where people could go. In this picture here, you can see a marker stone on the right, the one that's kind of yellowed from with kind of slightly Rain Street, that was set up to mark the anniversary of this meeting, and so on. I visited this place. This photograph was taken on the 3rd of April this year. So I went there on his actual birthday after we'd had our meeting at Englesea Brook, our service to celebrate him. I then got in the car and went here in a lonely pilgrimage to this site just to pray for Hugh Bourne at the place where his church movement really began. There was no one else there apart from a group of schoolgirls taking selfies in the ruins. So I had it kind of to myself, a very peaceful place, which for me, as somebody who likes outdoor spirituality, I had a lovely time there just thinking about praying for Hugh Bourne and his ongoing witness. So this was where they met, that amazing first event where they all gathered in 1807. And it was so successful, they had a follow-up meeting in August of the same year. And at first, Hugh Bourne and his colleague William Clowes, who you've seen the picture of on that plate, they referred to themselves as the Camp Meeting Methodists, not the Primitive Methodists. They only used that name 4 years later. So initially, they saw themselves as that camp, a camp meeting. Campus is the word for field, but also means camping, obviously. So a camp meeting was their kind of way to be outdoor worship. And just because I really like landmarks and spirituality, Mau-Cop itself is probably the site of very ancient Neolithic ritual activity. There's a huge rock near its summit, a 20-meter long rock that is thought to be the site of some kind of Neolithic cairn or a ritual site. So the point I'd like to make here is Hugh Bourne came here to this kind of landmarky place, but this isn't a new phenomenon at all. Communities are attracted to landscape features that stand out, and spiritual connections adhere to them, and they do so in a really successful way that lasts and endures, and they lay down really long markers. People are attracted, and people write very long memories into the landscape where religious activity and the landscape coincide. You get something very powerful, and I think that's something that the church and other religions have used very successfully in the past, and perhaps don't use so much now. But the spiritual significance is woven into the landscape over very, very long periods of history, and places like Mau-Cop are no exception. there it is. That's from the village itself as you drive in. So you can see it does stand out. I mean, that, you know, even it just as a landmark, that's, you know, the craggy rocks and so on. It's quite notable. So it doesn't really need the little Gothic tower on top, but anyway, it does kind of embellish this kind of craggy, eerie sense, this sort of Gothic feeling of it. And Hugh Bourne himself recognized that. He called this the Holy Mountain, this site. He actually referred to it in that way. And it has seen ongoing ritual use from Methodists too. And anniversary camp meetings, quite big ones, have been held here on that hillside to celebrate the 100th anniversary, 150th, and the 200th anniversary. I don't know if anyone here was at the 200th anniversary, but I suspect you will reveal yourselves if you were. That was in 2007. They had the 200th anniversary, and it's just about possible that somebody here was at the 150th as well, which would have been 65 years ago, but you'd have been a nipper then if you were, I'm sure. But anyway, if anyone was there at these revivals where this site continued its importance, it was there. So Hugh Bourne said, I am following the example of the Wesley brothers, and he would in particular point to how outdoor meetings had taken off in America. And I have one of my colleagues is on here who's interested in American spirituality. He used the American development of camp meetings, of large outdoor meetings, almost as his kind of like credentials to justify, to explain why he needed to do it, why in Britain it would be a good thing too. So he said, look, it's become, you know, this is part of our growth as a movement. Look what they're doing in America. And he tried that on with the Methodist Church in Britain. And you probably won't be surprised. Well, you probably all know, but he encountered stiff opposition despite trying to say, well, look, this is what the early Methodists did. This is working really well in America. A ruling from the Wesleyan Conference of 1807 declared, it is our judgment, even supposing such meetings to be allowable in America, little grudging thing there, they are highly improper in England and likely to be productive of considerable mischief. Isn't that wonderful? I just can't think of a better advert for a church worship. But there we go. Productive of considerable mischief. And we disdain all connection with them, without an X in, just to make the point. You're nothing to do with us. So there we go. That was the reaction when Hugh Bourne was trying to set up his outdoor meetings. We're not having any of it. Stop with your carry on. So that kind of the church and that kind of binary of the early Methodists, the binary of church and street, church and tree that the early Methodists set up, had become a binary of church and chapel. It's like they'd said, well, we've now got our buildings, we need to fill them. We're kind of calming down, we're taming. It's going to be improper to go out there and produce mischief if you go and carry on with this kind of thing. So they were there. So that was it really. And a year later, Hugh Bourne was expelled from the formal Methodist Church, claiming you have a tendency to set up other than the ordinary worship. I can't think of a bigger badge of honor myself, but anyway, he was kicked out. And ordinary, obviously, in this case means chapel-based worship and more tame. So Hugh Bourne was asked to leave, or told to leave, made to leave the Methodist Church in 1808 because of his devotion to outdoor worship in particular, the way he saw it as being the big thing. So it was then after that the new church movement was born, ironically quite similar to how John and Charles Wesley developed themselves, and it was characterized by outdoor gatherings. It scarcely needs adding that, in fact, it wasn't long before the primitive Methodists themselves began to build their own chapels again, and that kind of domestication kicked in again. Outdoor Methodist worship continued and has continued, and particularly in the more favorable climate of America. And I think that's another paper will be presented on that in due course, I'm sure. But the camp meeting did become a staple of Christian worship in American Methodism in particular. And it's argued that those camp meetings and that outdoor worship did eventually evolve into the modern day church festival. And I think that is something the Methodists can claim some credit for. Things like Green Belt, Spring Harvest, New Wine arguably reflect that kind of ongoing legacy of that tradition back in the UK, obviously different amounts of exposure to the rain, depending on how they organise them. But the modern day church festival, I think, was definitely, certainly what the primitive Methodists were doing was a precursor. So I think Hugh Bourne, I think on his 250th year, we can give him at least some credit for that move in the church, which I know has been a popular thing. And as a dad of a 15-year-old daughter, I have to say things like that are really good ways to energize children and families along. And Hugh Bourne knew that. Hugh Bourne knew that this was a way to get popular, kind of popular appeal and popular kind of following, and also get children a bit more interested. So over this past year, I've become quite fond of the man, Hugh Bourne, looking at where the various places of his life and so on. This is his grave at Englesea Brook, where I went to visit. And again, Ruth, I'm doing a bit of advertising for you here. This is just next door to the chapel and the museum, a very peaceful little spot. That's his grave in the very middle at the end of the path. So I understand why we're doing a 250th for him. Now, Hugh was a lay minister throughout his life. He didn't go to have extensive education. He was taught to read by his mother, again, and his mother helped, as I say, convert him to Methodism. He never married, but women did play an influential and really very positive role in his thinking during his time leading the primitive Methodists. And he wasn't, he was actually a passionate believer in this. He believed that the existence of women preachers and their success was a sign of the church's revival. He passionately argued that women preachers had what he called an extraordinary calling. This is one Methodist preacher. She wasn't a primitive Methodist. Elizabeth Evans, again, others will talk on her, and I'll just touch on her now because I don't want this all to be about a man, and he wouldn't want it either, because he did so. He had a very broad vision, and he wanted to include women from the start with the kind of voice in the church. And Elizabeth Evans was a powerful female Methodist preacher from Wirksworth in Derbyshire, and listening to her, and as I often say, men need to shut up and listen in the church quite a lot. So I know I'm talking here, but I will stop and have conversation. But I do believe very much in that plurality of voices as well, and we just have to do things differently, really. And he praised, Hugh Bourne was very, very impressed by shutting up and listening to Elizabeth Evans, listened to her and took on board what she was saying, and was really taken by it. Needless to say, I'm afraid, she herself was sidelined by the Methodist Church, which shows just how refreshing Hugh Bourne's attitude was. Again, like the outdoor worship, he saw Elizabeth preaching and thought, this is brilliant, we need to do more of this. And he wasn't just reflecting a general mood among working class Christians that we needed a plurality of voices. He actually believed and promoted women preachers. In 1842, Hugh Bourne was sidelined eventually from leadership of the primitive Methodists, the group he'd set up, done so much. And after that date, no more female itinerant preachers were licensed by the church. So it was really partly driven by him. And I'd like to stress that aspect alongside his love of outdoor worship and preaching, just because I do think there's connections between the two. He also had a great ministry, a great calling for ministry to children, and he placed great emphasis on the establishment of Sunday schools. He wrote a grammar book and other educational manuals with his brother James to help spread education, particularly among the poor and working class. And the reason why I want to talk about those two aspects as well, and this isn't a pun really, but I think like a lot of innovative Christians, he liked to think outside the box. If you take the box to be the kind of more trammeled world of the chapel or the church, he would think outside the box. He did not confine his sense of holiness and the purpose and mission of the church to a couple of hours on a Sunday morning in a building set apart. But he had a much wider vision of Christianity. It was one that saw social improvement and female empowerment as signs also of God's kingdom being built on earth. Maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think so at all. I think this emphasis on outdoor worship that he picked up on and preaching, that goes hand in hand with church innovation. church revival, church renewal. And I think that's true throughout a long period of religious history. I think you can look back all the way through our recorded spiritual history. Outdoors is where religious innovation, reform, and renewal do take hold. And as I say, I'm going to set this with some nice pictures in a bit, just to show kind of outdoor worship places. Hugh Bourne himself, he realized this was not this was part of tradition in religion. This is one of my favorite quotes from him. He said his open air preaching was inspired by none other than Adam and Eve themselves in paradise. He put it really forcefully. He had this thing: worship in the open air commenced with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when in a state of innocence, our Lord Jesus Christ carried on religious services in the open air, and his apostles followed his example. So it's important. He placed great emphasis, placing this move to the outdoors really deeply into religious tradition. I myself wrote a book a few years ago called The Naked Hermit, inspired by Adam and Eve, more literally so than him. And I can state authoritatively, though, Hugh Bourne definitely kept his clothes very much on when he was going out into the wilderness, replicating the Garden of Eden. But he was very sensitive to this long tradition of spiritual connection to nature. And some Christians did take it even further. The Naked Hermit were actually historical figures, and some Celtic Christians as well would actually push themselves out into the natural world, completely unmediated, a very raw spirituality. But he was tapping into some of that as well in a slightly more sedate early 19th century way. And the big question is really, and I put that quote up there with this question hovering, was this Methodist and primitive Methodist embrace of the streets, the parks, the fields, the trees, the grass, the lawns and so on, was it actually part of a deliberate, conscious attachment to the natural environment, to the natural world? Or was it simply they're making a virtue of necessity because they've been kicked out of churches? And I think it's an important point for us in the church to ponder that one a bit. There's times now we're seeing a small signs of new interest in worship in the outdoors again. We were talking about Forest Church just earlier before we started, to start placing great emphasis on the importance of the environment and the remit of Christian teaching and action in the outdoors, of connecting back to nature again. And as I say, nearly all church movements like to say they're modelled on the early church. In fact, it'd be surprising to find a church that wasn't modelled on the early church. They didn't say that. And the early, the Methodists themselves, John and Charles Wesley, were said to have been inspired by the spirituality of the early desert fathers and mothers, as a theory promoted in a few books. The Word in the Desert picks it up. Albert Outler as well has seen those traces, that they were driven by that same kind of desire for outdoor worship that drove people like Anthony the Great, Paul the Hermit into the wild. Christians who took their faith out of the towns and cities and developed a new form of worship in the 4th century, immersed in the natural world. So I think there is a kind of awareness of that heritage. Outdoor worship has an amazingly rich and enduring history in Christianity, connecting spiritual experience to place. Jesus himself, as Hugh Bourne picked up on, went into the mountains. He went into the mountains to meet the devil during his 40 days of temptation. Again, Jesus went for his transfiguration up onto onto a mountain, an event which echoes what happened on Mount Sinai, the holy mountain. And as we heard, Hugh Bourne himself picked up that idea that Mao Cop, that kind of hillock with the folly on top, was actually his holy mountain. He compared it to Mount Sinai, that great place, the founding place for the kind of commandments of the Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. And so much of the early church, so much of religion and spirituality has that active engagement with the landscape, using the land to embellish the message. We don't nowadays, perhaps so much, maybe some of us do actually, go up a mountain to pray. I've done it. I've climbed up a mountain, spent the night up there in prayer once, the Mountain of Angels in Wales, and it was probably the most moving experience of my whole life in a spiritual sense. So I've done that, and I love it, and I think other people I know have been very drawn into that kind of very intense landscape spirituality. Hugh Bourne certainly encouraged his followers to climb up to Mao Cop, and countless generations of Christians before him have done that. And I'm going to just sort of, with the last bit, really have a run through some really interesting places where you can see the long legacy. There's lots of places at the top of hills and mountains where people have gone to pray. Really quite striking sites all around Britain. There's this place here in Cornwall, Roach Chapel, St Michael's Hermitage Chapel, a place of prayer where people would go and sometimes converse with angels. There's this place here in Torquay, St Michael's Chapel. Again, they're all dedicated to angels, the messenger from God coming down. It's a great place to preach, where you've got St Michael there. The idea that St Michael came down as that intermediary where you hear God's word. The mountaintop is where you get the message from God. Again, the 10 Commandments were handed down on a mountain. There's something really resonant about it. I've got books and books on this, so I'm not going to explain that, but I mean, it's the mountain as a place for revelation is enormously powerful. St Michael's Mount is another one, very famous, and of course one of our most iconic landscapes, Glastonbury Tor, again a church built on top of that high point. Missionaries would regularly pick pieces of rock or land on which to stand and to preach, obviously echoing the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus himself did, passing on the word from the top of the mountain. This is a preaching place in Skye in the 7th century, and as I say, a kind of early prototype for someone like Hugh Bourne was doing, standing on this rock and preaching to the people. It's been done before. This is another place called St Wilfrid's Pulpit in North Yorkshire. And the reason the actual rock is really boring. If you go and see it, it's on the right of this picture, on the pathway. It's just like just a rock sitting by the river. But below it is there's a kind of really deep pool in this river here. And as you can see, people go and do a practice called tombstoning, where they leap off St Wilfrid's Pulpit down into the river below. And the reason I stuck that picture in, partly it's more interesting than the picture of the stone, which isn't much, but it's also, this is where people go and have fun. And this is where young people go and they enjoy doing stuff. And it's, you know, it's just a place where people can interact, where there is, you know, young people don't go and do that kind of thing in church. Certainly, well, not in my church anyway. I don't know about you lot, but that's not, you know, that kind of thing, that very bodily connection to the landscape. The kind of place where you go, you've got the river there and you've got the limestone opposite and it's all craggy and so on. It's fun. It's where people are at. And that's what Hugh Bourne was doing, taking people to where they're at. You can't not look at Mao Cop, even as a child, and think, oh, what's all that about? What's up there? You want to go and explore it. You want to go and investigate it. And this brings me to my last preaching rock, which is Furbank Fell in Cumbria. And this is just, this is a few miles away from the earliest Quaker meeting house and a place called Brig Flats in Cumbria. And this place here is where George Fox visited. It's a really isolated spot. Even today, it's the middle of nowhere. And he preached to a congregation of more than 1,000 people who came here. He preached for 3 hours. So I'm not quite sure how adventurous and adrenaline-filled that whole 3 hours was. But anyway, he preached a sermon on there. But it's a lovely craggy spot again. Hugh Bourne himself was drawn to the Quakers for a time. And some of the early primitive Methodists were inspired by that nonconformist tradition of going out there. Some of the crowds at Mao Cop were said to have been trembling during the preaching and worship, is where the word Quaker comes from as well. So you can see the connections. And I do think there's a bigger point that emerges here, which is that comparing the stories of the Hebrew Bible, of Christ's mission, the early church, the desert fathers and mothers, the medieval church, and then on to the outdoor preaching of the Methodists and the primitive Methodists, my conclusion is, and I'm going to show you the last slide now, is that all reform movements in the church, pretty much, you probably can think of some that weren't, but pretty much all reform movements in the church are marked by a period in the outdoors when they really do take on and embrace the outdoors. We only need to think of John the Baptist and his own message of reform and repentance, which he preached from the wilderness. He deliberately said, I'm not preaching from the synagogue and the town. I'm going out here to say just how embedded this idea is in our tradition. Sometimes they were persecuted, sometimes not. The desert fathers and mothers went out into the desert because the church was suddenly being domesticated and was suddenly being approved by the emperor, being accepted into the fold. They wanted to go out and push it back into the wild again, rediscover some raw spirituality. The Lollards meet outdoors. Another great reformer is Francis of Assisi. There's just so many iterations of this al fresco spirituality that coincides with the time of renewal and reform. Landscape spirituality brings a bracing breeze to established religion. And I think it does that both literally, a bracing breeze from the wind, but also metaphorically. Hugh Bourne was thinking in new ways, and his focus on female preachers is one example of that. So it may be a chance, it may be total coincidence, but I personally think the outdoors, the natural world, is where religion and Christianity is most reinvigorated. Maybe the time has come again for the church to head out. Maybe the churches of Britain could do with a bit of fresh air right now. I'd leave it up to you to think about that. The one thing I'm sure about is that the next big reform and renewal movement in established churches will have some aspect of connection to nature, to the landscape, to the environment. There are many paths up the mountain, as they say, and Hugh Bourne's own footsteps show us one very good way up there. Thank you very much indeed.